Latin America has been embracing Korean culture in recent years. And on Press Perspective today, we touch upon the factors fueling this phenomenon. Do stay with us. Hello and welcome to Press Perspective for this Tuesday, April 14th here in Seoul. I'm Min Sun-hee. Today we delve into the popularity of K-culture in Latin America. For this, I have Ruy Valdes with Spanish news agency EFE Spain here in the studio. Ruy, welcome back.
Nice to be here, Sun-hee.
I also have freelance journalist John Bartlett joining our talk virtually from Chile. John, it's an absolute pleasure.
Thank you for having me.
Ruy, we'll start here in the studio. Let's start then with your thoughts regarding the interest in K-culture in Latin America. How would you say does it compare to the past?
Well, it's quite a long story. I'll do my best to integrate it as brief as possible. But well, based also in John's article, which he integrated very well this history, we could talk about the presence of K-culture in different eras. First, the early roots, which was a migration that started from the beginning of the 1905, to be precise, when they arrived, a big group of immigrants from Korea to Mexico, to the Port of Mexico, which has a very dark history of abuse and forced labors that we're not going to get into today. And then there are then more like working class or people that emigrated to Latin America in search for better jobs and create some more, united communities. And what we could talk as a real presence of K-culture back in the day, we will have to add sports a little bit forcefully. Like Taekwondo was actually a kind of a big thing, especially in countries like Mexico. We have medalists of all kinds in the country because of the presence of that. So you ask somebody about Korea back in the day, probably they would say, well, Taekwondo, and that's it. But they will never talk to you about the music, let alone the cuisine. And then we jump into this little by little influence that starts early 2000s. Of Korean culture, very niche still, very small groups, then to jump a little bit ahead on time with consolidation on Psy, Gangnam Style, or, well, not that long ago when Parasite won the Oscar, and of course all the Korean dramas that expanded their influence not only in the entertainment, but also in other sectors like K-cuisine, like the food, because the audience saw these famous actors and actresses consuming certain types of products, using certain types of cosmetics, using certain type of fashion. So little by little, we have this whole expansion that to today, we can call it now a stage of deep integration and local adaptation. So right now, maybe before we could talk about it as a phenomenon, like a sporadic phenomenon, now we cannot talk about it in those terms. It is the pop culture of today. You cannot ignore Korean culture, especially in music and entertainment industry. And when I talk about deep integration and local adaptation, is that you now can see this merge of not only, of both cultures, of Latin America and Korean culture. One of the biggest examples now, HYBE, the label of BTS, created this group called Santos Bravos, which is a K-pop Latin American group, which their songs are in Spanish. So that would be like a very big example of where all this is heading, right? It's like both cultures are, feedbacking, if I'm making up that word, but giving themselves feedback and evolving into something new. And yeah, well, not to take such a long time on this, I would say that lastly, just to see, for example, the intentions of labels like HYBE, they just recently signed the latest album of Daddy Yankee. Maybe he by name doesn't sound as big in Korea, but I'm sure you have listened to his songs. He's like the father of this genre, reggaeton. So the fact that a South Korean label is making contracts with one of the biggest stars in music in Latin America tells you a lot about the future of this.
Right, indeed. Now, John, as As Ruy here in Seoul mentioned very briefly, you recently did an extensive piece, a team coverage, I believe, for The Guardian about the popularity of K-culture in Latin America. What's been your experience, that is, of covering K-culture there in Chile?
Yeah, so this is something I've been really interested in for a long time. In Chile, we have I wouldn't even call it a Koreatown. It's a tiny little sort of it's basically 2 streets across the river, where a lot of the Korean community settled in Chile, mostly in the 1970s and 1980s. So it's not something that comes from a big diaspora. That's often the case in Latin America, as Ruy mentioned there. The Mexican diaspora was one of the, was the first, and then some of them obviously went on after these sort of quite dark episode of slavery and forced labor in the agave plantations on the peninsula there in Mexico. Some of them that went on to Mexico, others went to Hawaii. I mean, the diaspora grew in the Americas around that time, around the turn of the century. But here in Chile, it's a tiny number of people that have actually come, and I've wanted to write something about it for a long time. And my original idea was to write something about Chile. I thought that the diaspora here was, kind of becoming overwhelmed by this interest in Korean culture. I mean, now I think I reference this in my story. We went from, 5 or 6 Korean restaurants, even when I got to Chile 8 years ago, and now there are nearly 50, I think, in that one tiny neighborhood where a lot of the owners are Chileans who are kind of profiting from the boom. People really interested in K-dramas and K-pop, obviously. I mean, that's the kind of driving force, I think, here in Chile, where we already have quite a lot of influence of other Asian cultures, but Korean culture has just become this phenomenon. It's absolutely amazing how it's happened here. So I started with that, really. I looked at kind of how people were, how people were taking Korean culture, taking it on. They were starting to listen to music that I hadn't heard much of before, but obviously I think now we've all heard, some kind of, BTS or Blackpink or one of the big K-pop bands, whether we know it or not. And then I saw these kids dancing in the reflections. I mean, I think that's a kind of a thing that's happening all over the world at the moment. Sort of young people taking these dances and really getting involved with these the kind of the K-pop culture. So yeah, I got into that, and then I started to mention it to friends and talk to different people here, and people mentioned other factors I'd never thought about before. One of the big things at the moment, and I'm not sure how this is kind of translating in Korea as well, but here in Latin America is skincare. I mean, a lot of people talk about kind of Korean skincare here in Chile, in different countries as well. One of the influencers I talked to as well, a Korean influencer, she told me that most of her endorsements now come from skincare companies, rather than these K-dramas or K-pop or any of these other elements of the culture. So yeah, that's how I started. And my editor said to me, why don't we make this a regional story? And my colleagues in Mexico and Brazil got involved as well and sent in some great sort of feeds and interviews from these different countries.
Right, it was a great report, if I may say so myself. Ruy, with regard to K-pop, I remember Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum. She kindly invited BTS to hold more concerts in Mexico. How significant would you say is cultural diplomacy between South Korea and its counterpart in Latin America?
Well, I would say now is more important than ever. And I will make maybe a little bit of a stretch connecting to the current state of affairs in the world. But well, let's start explaining. Yes, indeed, the Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum invited President Lee Jae-myung. Oh, well, first of all, she asked President Lee Jae-myung if he could help her to open more dates for concerts of BTS, considering that the demand in Mexico was so high that prices were skyrocketing in reselling, or also there was basically no tickets. They all sold out very fast, so it was very hard to get. Of course, Mexican president is also using it as a political strategy to attract young voters. But putting those things aside, what is interesting is how come a president at that level can publicly send or inform that he's sending this type of letter for this kind of matters of a group that is owned by a private company or whatever, but now as a tool, as you mentioned, for cultural diplomacy. Later on, she expanded that she invited President Jae-myung in September. This has not been confirmed by the Blue House. But yeah, well, at least maybe it's a sign that there's a strong interest to meet. The other thing that is worth to note is that when she mentioned this invitation, again, she's putting it in the context of BTS. She's not saying, okay, we're gonna talk about Korean investments or companies that are there. She's saying, oh, okay, we will discuss about opening more dates or maybe organizing a live concerts or mentions of that sort. Why I think now is more important than ever, this cultural diplomacy. Well, right now, South Korea especially is in a moment where they have explicitly said that they are reaching to other countries, other regions, to sign trade agreements or things related to energy amid all the of the war in the Middle East, which of course Korea imports most of its oil from there. I am not saying that it's going to be a fact or it's going to be hard to know if actually it's going to be like a bargain coin precisely. But of course, I do think it's important to first establish a connection between two countries that are making some kind of deal. So it's very different now to approach Mexico as, let's say, 10, 15 years ago when K-culture was not as big as today. And to now that's saying, okay, the president of Korea is coming to Mexico, or he's coming to Chile, or he's coming to Latin American countries where K-culture has a very high presence. And I think that will get the attention not only in the political sphere, but also just in the general public, no? So yeah, I do think it has become this, it has acquired a relevance that it's very hard, it was very hard to predict in the past.
Right, indeed it was. John, what do you believe are the factors that appear to be fueling the popularity of K-culture in Latin America?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think that the most sort of visible face of all of this, I think, was K-pop to start with. Like I say, that's how I kind of, became more aware of what was happening. But nowadays it seems to be, these dramas as well. Squid Game was a huge, huge success here, as it was all over the world, of course. But particularly here in Chile, I remember there was a sort of time where people were, as soon as the second series of that came out, there were the masks were being sold on the street in Chile, which I think is interesting sort of ironies there as well, given what it's largely a sort of capitalist satire. But it was a very interesting sort of moment where all of these kind of sort of memorabilia and masks and things were being sold. Obviously, K-pop is still absolutely huge here. A lot of the restaurants that you can Korean restaurants that you can go to kind of have these videos on loop and are constantly playing these sort of K-pop hits and things. I think one interesting thing here, particularly in Chile, actually, is that, as I mentioned before, we've had these, Asian cultures have always had quite a lot of prevalence here in Chilean culture. I mean, Japanese kind of manga and cartoons and animation has been, huge here in the country for a really long time. And that goes back kind of, even before the sort of the Korean diaspora, arrived here in any meaningful numbers. So yeah, I think, there was already sort of fertile ground here, particularly in Chile. And I think a lot of other countries as well in the region. I mean, I know that in Peru, I think in Argentina, slightly less. They have a slightly more kind of pride, I guess, or not pride in their own culture, but they have more of a sort of, insular kind of culture, I guess, in Argentina than in certain other countries in the region. But I think that the fact that these sort of, Japanese culture arrived here first, people were already used to seeing these cartoons. They were already used to often watching kind of, subtitled sort of Japanese shows, for example. When Korean shows came along, they seemed to, perhaps not replaced it so far, but they seem to have, sort of taken precedence, I think. So yeah, it's really interesting. But I'd say that the growth at the moment is in series, in K-dramas, in these sort of, sort of telenovelas, basically, that you get in Latin America. And people are watching Korean shows now, which, certainly when I first arrived here, I wasn't aware of. Maybe it was already happening, but I think it's really grown in the last few years.
Right, K-Screen Productions and of course K-Beauty, as you mentioned earlier. Ruy, the Culture Ministry here, it recently unveiled its latest overseas Hallyu survey. If I were to ask you to highlight 2 key findings in this latest survey, what would you choose to highlight?
Well, the main highlight here is that almost 70% of respondents who have experienced Korean cultural content of any sort, they have a positive perception on it. The second highlight, I will skip music because we already discussed about music, but one thing that really caught my attention was that food ranks higher in this survey, and this survey was made from people of 30 different countries. And in this survey, 78% of the people say they have tried Korean cuisine. I'm making an emphasis on this because I don't think that's something, let's say, why do I think that is relevant? It's because if you go, even I'm from provincial city in Mexico. If I would think about my childhood or my younger years, I would never imagine going to a Korean restaurant. Probably there was just one restaurant, no, just few people would go, probably the same Korean community will go to a restaurant. And yes, if you go right now back to that city, it's massive, the explosion. Like you have dozens at least of Korean restaurants, and you talk to people, and what did you do on the weekend? Well, I went to a Korean barbecue, and like, really? In León, in my city? Well, yeah, so I think well, these numbers really reflect everything that we have discussed of the impact that it has right now in the region.
Right. I mean, as John was saying, there were 5 restaurants in Chile when he arrived there first 8 years ago, and now there are more than 50 or so. John, your article, right, it quotes the Brazilian health minister to explain Latin America's interest in Asian culture. I wonder, would you like to take this opportunity to perhaps elaborate on his thoughts and your takeaways?
Yeah, so that interview actually my colleague in Brazil did, but I think it was a really important sort of, a really important element to this whole story. And it's something that I emphasized when I kind of, pitched this idea at the beginning. I thought he basically what Alexandre Padilla is called. He said that his daughter basically kind of, looks to Korea now, looks across the Pacific rather than to North America for her sort of, cultural influences and things. So I think that it's a really important thing. I mean, if we're all following kind of world events at the moment, and I think that as the US continues on the path it's on at the moment, I mean, there's this sort of, obviously this sort of introspection and sort of inward looking that they're doing in terms of foreign policy and even culture to an extent as well. I think that people here in Latin America are looking less towards the north. Obviously, there's always going to be a relationship between the US and Latin America, and this sort of famous idea that it's the US's backyard that they talk about a lot. But I think that, Ruy maybe can talk about this as well, that Mexico obviously is much closer to the US, sharing a long border. But, down here in Chile, I think the people are looking far less towards North America nowadays. And I don't know if that has anything to do necessarily with, the direction that the US has taken, but I do think it's certainly a phenomenon that's worth studying. And I think there's an opportunity for Korea there as well, if we talk about the Hallyu and sort of this soft power approach that South Korea has. There's an opportunity in Latin America, and I think that in a lot of countries around the world, as they start to perhaps not turn their backs on the US, but as people start to look elsewhere, and maybe North American culture doesn't hold quite the appeal that it used to. So yeah, I think it's really interesting, and I think on the food as well, which is something that Ruy was discussing there before. I think that's something that's arrived in Chile relatively recently. And I think that it's interesting looking at kind of how those two kind of culinary sort of like cultures, how they interact, because in Latin America, parts of Latin America, people really like spicy food. Here in Chile, people do not like spicy food at all. Like Chilean food is incredibly, I won't say bland, but it's not spicy. Let's put it that way. So I mean, it's kind of introducing these kind of fermented foods like kimchi, getting spicy foods, people here to try them, and I think it's really starting to take off here. Like tastes are changing, and I think Korean cuisine actually is playing quite a large part in that. People are starting to try things that just weren't available here before, or kind of the ingredients have been replaced, and as often happens in diasporas, people end up kind of trying to make the dishes they used to back home with the ingredients available to them in the country they settle in. So things have changed quite quickly here, and I think that Korean culture is having a really outsized influence in a lot of aspects of Chilean society.
Right, indeed. So the Korean wave, it started off, like we mentioned earlier, with K-pop, moving on to K-dramas, and then including K-beauty, K-skincare, as John mentioned. In recent times, though, there have also been greater interest in Korean history. This being said, how far does this overall interest in the Korean wave look to go, and what do you hope it will include in the future?
Well, I think as related to everything we have been discussing. Like many of these dramas that we were mentioning, some are even set in historical periods, and similarly we see now with K-pop Demon Hunters, this big hit in Netflix, that they also include traditional elements of Korean culture, and they go too far on the past, and they show you different aesthetics or elements that are more connected not to pop culture but to history, to ancient history of Korea. So yes, in a way it's a consequence of what we have been discussing. So the next step, or what we're seeing right now, is there's not only interest in pop culture but also in history, in language, culture, identity, all these elements. And for example, you could see this happening a lot in the students level, university students level. Like before, when I arrived to Korea 2017, I think there was maybe more than 100 Mexicans in Korea. Now it's on the thousands. And it's because they're counting the students that are here in long-term periods. You walk around during the BTS concert and you see these, many of them are people that are studying here, and it's now not limited only to this cultural part. This student could be a student of Korean studies. It could be a student of mechanical engineering. It can be a student of all these different, or history, to put it in that sense. But it's inevitable that they will end up absorbing these other elements if they are constantly consuming Korean content or different aspects of Korean culture. So basically what we're seeing is a growing trend of people getting more interested, like the users in Duolingo, or like people that come here just to experience that part of the culture. If you walk these days, just as a personal experience also, if you walk these days through downtown Seoul, and I'm talking about the last 6 months, not the last year, the last 6 months, it's really impressive how many people you see speaking Spanish or Portuguese. I've never seen anything like that in all my years here. And they are not only visiting, of course, Hive headquarters. They are going to the main palace. They are going to see King Sejong's statue, etc., etc. So I think it's inevitable consequences of all this.
Right, indeed. And speaking as a South Korean, I believe it's a very flattering and humbling experience to see so many foreign visitors choosing to visit South Korea. I'm afraid that's all the time we have. Ruy, as always, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Sun-hee.
John, all the way in Chile, thank you so much for joining us at this very early hour at your end. Right, I'm afraid, John, we can't hear you, but I'm assuming you're saying thank you for having you on, right?
Having me.
All right. Right. Well, that ends this edition of Press Perspective. As always, thank you for watching. See you again same time tomorrow. That is Wednesday.